Quake, the almighty dark god of first-person shooters with its gothic castles, eldritch horrors, and techno-brutalism, has become ray-traced. Sultim Tsyrendashiev, the maker of Path-Traced Serious Sam, Path-Traced Doom, and the upcoming Path-Traced Half-Life, has somehow found the time to turn the Vulkan port of Quake by Axel Knighting into a fully path-traced renderer, and the results are incredibly cool. In today's video, I will examine this ray tracing infused port of Quake, and I will talk about what it adds and does with comparisons to the original Quake. And as always, I will briefly touch on performance for those of you interested in checking it out, which I definitely recommend doing. So let's talk about the obvious stuff first. How do you even check this out? You simply download the necessary files from the VK Quake-RT GitHub page, merge them with the version of Quake you own per the instructions on the page, and play. It's all relatively straightforward when you do follow those instructions, but there is one instruction I recommend deviating from, and that has to do with image reconstruction. When you do get into game, the first thing I recommend doing is turning on image reconstruction technology. On AMD or Intel cards, that means FSR2 and DLSS on NVIDIA. Now FSR2 here looks generally pretty great in the default setup. Some light ghosting on certain particles at times, but it's generally mostly fine. The same cannot be said of the recommended DLSS 2.4.0 that is linked on the GitHub page instructions. So I definitely recommend using a pre-2.3 version of DLSS like 2.26. You can find a reputable link to that at Tech PowerUp, for example. Why do I recommend using a decidedly older version of DLSS? Well, it appears that later versions of DLSS have serious regressions. For example, when the camera is sitting still with the GitHub recommended 2.4.0 version of DLSS, moving objects turn into smeary things. This floating nail gun in the middle, for example, with that version of DLSS looks rather rough, something that is not visible in the older 2.26 DLSS version on the right or in FSR2 on the left. Similarly, the GitHub recommended DLSS 2.4.0 version can produce weird behavior when the camera is sitting still with flashing lights. Like here, the light flashing at the stage beginning looks rather wrong in the middle. And lastly, this older version of DLSS can clear up issues seen both in FSR2 and in that later version of DLSS, like this water surface here. FSR2 and DLSS 2.40 have the water turn into a murky, shimmery, ghosty thing when the camera sits still and settles. Older DLSS 2.26 in that shot is crystal clear on the water and looks awesome in comparison. Same with this shot here when we look at the shotgun intersecting with the water close to the camera. Blurry and ghosty on the left and the middle, and crystal clear on the far right with an older version of DLSS. So yes, if you are on NVIDIA, definitely use an older DLL like 2.26 that I'm recommending here. And if you're on AMD or Intel, most of the time FSR2 is just going to be pretty fine. But enough about image quality, as the other options in the menu are far more interesting here. Specifically the two rendering types. With one option, you have the choice of classic Quake renderer with light ray tracing enhancements, or a version of the renderer called Ray Traced, which utilizes path tracing essentially to bring a new artistic look to Quake. First, let me detail that classic renderer option here. The classic renderer is for those of you who want to see Quake being more or less the same as it has always been, but with some light ray tracing flourishes. This classic Quake renderer actually appears to utilize ray tracing for all the primary rendering of geometry and such, but the lighting is still done through the classic texture-based light maps like the original Quake. That means you'll get a similar lighting look and a general ambiance that is very similar to the original game, but certain things can leverage the fact that the primary rendering is now done through RT. Water surfaces, for example, look completely different. They have a moving watery surface and reflections that show off all of the game's surroundings in them. You also get ray tracing specific view distortion effects when underwater as well. One of the more neat additions to this classic renderer is how teleporter surfaces show the area that you're teleporting to on their surface, essentially spawning rays from a plane in the area where the teleporter end is located. So you see a hazy, ever-moving, fully lit area on the teleporter surfaces that tells you where you will end up. It looks pretty cool, and it also helps you navigate Quake better than the original game, as now you can tell where you're going when you get into a teleporter. It's quite cool, but those are the main differences of that classic renderer. The quote-unquote ray-traced renderer offers a different artistic look that will more radically transform Quake by leveraging path tracing for all of the game's lighting, fully replacing the light maps and other tricks that Quake used to simulate the look of light back in 1996. With the path trace renderer, all lighting is now done in real time, usually emanating from the exact same spot or location where the original light was spawned from for the light maps used in the original Quake. So those indoor scenes with light from things like torches or other small sources of light will look similar, but noticeably different in how they affect the textures or objects that move through that space. You will see that moving objects like this gun on the floor here now have dynamic shadows being cast from those light sources, which can of course dramatically change the mood in those scenes where there's a bit more going on in the environment, where there's more things that could possibly obstruct the lighting. As a part of this, all muzzle flashes from your gun or enemy weapons cast light and shadow as well, leading to some pretty awesome moments in the dark that are more reminiscent of stuff you might have seen in Doom 3. One of my favorite things is how the lightning gun looks when it shoots. It casts all this light along the surface of the lightning trail leaving the muzzle. It looks brutal. Accompanying this real-time lighting are slight changes to some of the textures to make the light bounce around a bit more, so to speak. Things that look like they might be metallic tend to have a bit of sheen to them now. You can see that on your weapons at times, or on some of the scenery textures, which will lead to a different look on some surfaces, but a look that I generally appreciate. New materials extend to the very few glass fixtures that are found in Quake. Mosaic stained glass windows now have proper light transmission, where when you move around the stained glass window, you can see light reflecting and refracting through the glass, leading to an entirely new look for these type of surfaces. One of the biggest changes, though, is from the usage of emissive lighting surfaces, something that is really only possible through the utilization of ray tracing in real time. Basically, the surface of an object now emits light. It can be used for small things like you see here on the teleporter pad here in the game staging area, where the little red bits on the teleporter texture now cast light and shadow on the nearby surfaces. And yeah, as you notice here, this version of Quake now supports colored lighting as well. Something that was of course missing from the original Quake and only found its way into the id Tech engines past Quake 2. The addition of adding color to certain light sources is one of my favorite parts of this Quake port, and it makes some scenes reminiscent of those changes we might have seen in Quake 64. So you can kind of think of this as Quake remixed with colored lighting at times. But getting back to those emissive surfaces, this affects a lot of scenes in the game as there's large surfaces like lava which now emit light. So here again in the staging area, this lava pit you have to cross to choose the difficulty takes on a completely different look now as the area above the lava pit is bathed in that reddish orange glow of the lava below. In other scenes like this one, the shadows being cast from the light from that lava make the scene take on a different life of its own, dramatically changing the look of the scene and inserting a new level of dynamism definitely not present in the original game for sure. Perhaps the biggest difference from this emissive lighting comes from what it does to the sky. Now, the original Quake didn't really have a concept of sky lighting like Quake 2 kind of did. So outdoor scenes in Quake don't look so different from the indoor ones, as there's no sun, no skylight, and no color variation. With Path Trace Quake, those iconic purple skies now cast literal purple-hued light onto the world below, across the entire sky surface. So outdoor scenes with that purple sky take on this new nightmarish look. One of my favorite things the skylighting does is how it adds skylighting into scenes where there was none before. Windows open to that sky now have that sky lighting leak in, which can take otherwise plain looking scenes from the original game and giving them a different mood altogether. Complementing the sky lighting is the injection of frustum aligned voxel fog, which is also lit, as you can see here. It adds a lot to those scenes where it shows up prominently. The voxel grid is for sure a bit coarse, so you can see a bit of aliasing in the volumetric fog, but it looks good enough. And if you don't like it, you can separately turn it off in the options menu, reverting to a simple distance fog that is much less intrusive and divergent from the original Quake art style, which completely lacks fog. One of the more controversial changes comes from the change to the hazardous chemical pools in the game. Now, in the original, they're just like this off green and brown. In the path traced version, they took on a neon teal look. It sure does communicate really easily that this is a dangerous surface, but at times it does seem a bit overbearing in some environments where I imagine a less intense and more muted off-green would better fit the mood. That is just one gripe though here among a lot of other incredibly awesome things that visually spice up this port of Quake. Altogether, when playing it, it feels like a lost RTX remaster of Quake that we would have seen from a full-on professional studio. The added dynamism and color to scenes pushes that Quake texture art to the next level, and I think it looks utterly fantastic. Well, fantastic about 90% of the time, as it is real-time ray tracing we're talking about here, and there are going to be occasional issues as a result. For example, in the opening of the game, when you grab the nail gun here, the lights go out. We all remember this scene. But when they do go out, you see the distinct after image of the viewport lighting on the game world for an extended duration, which looks pretty awkward. Another issue is for those rare textured surfaces with a bit of specularity, like here. The specular lighting seems to update very slowly in this game. So when your gun shoots, it can produce this hilarious after effect on the world where you see the gunshot and muzzle flash on the surface for such a long time after you've fired. There aren't a lot of these surfaces in the game, so it doesn't happen often, but it is pretty funny. The last issue I found is that some scenes that lack a lot of direct lighting and instead are mostly lit from the sky, tend to look a bit speckled, like you can see here. Here the denoiser can only do so much given the low lighting conditions, so we see that speckled look overall. So there are some issues with the real-time ray tracing here, but they do not overly tarnish the presentation, and it is still an incredible experience to play this path-traced version of the game. Getting over to the performance, there's not much to say here as the settings menu is rather bare, and the few things that you can change don't actually greatly affect performance. For example, the classic renderer runs nearly the exact same as the quote-unquote ray-traced one, which is rather unexpected as the lighting is done differently, even though they are both being ray-traced. So your only consistent way to affect performance is by utilizing image reconstruction like I talked about earlier. For example, going from native 4K to 4K DLSS quality mode on an RTX 4090 improves performance by nearly 100%, and one can see similar near linear scaling as one goes down to performance or ultra performance mode. With the usage of reconstruction, you can find low-end GPUs like the RTX 2060, for example, being able to achieve a rather handsome 60 FPS with some headroom above that to spare at 1080p in DLSS quality mode. I would have loved to have shown the unlocked frame rate here on this GPU, but this game seems to have screen compositing always on, even with VSync off, so I can't exactly easily show unlocked frame rates using our tools. But I can still do head-to-heads as long as I use unrealistically high resolutions, like 4K. There I pit the AMD RX 6800 XT against the NVIDIA RTX 3080, and I saw that the RTX 3080 in this title is running usually 2 times the raw frame rate of the 6800 XT at this very high resolution. That's par for the course that we expect for a path trace title, but I still think we're looking at AMD having issues in this title that are a bit unwarranted. For example, the RTX 3080 on the right here can easily play this game at a locked 60 FPS in 4K DLSS quality mode, but the 6800 XT even has trouble hitting 60 FPS in FSR2 performance mode. That really doesn't make sense. Given the performance disparity I showed at 4K, I really would expect to see the 6800 XT having a completely fine locked 60 FPS in FSR performance mode here, 4K, but it appears that this fan-made title, even with the AMD specific build that I'm using, just hasn't been properly tuned or tested to make sure all the issues are worked out on AMD GPUs, which is a real shame as it seems like it would otherwise have rather acceptable performance on them. And with that being said, we've come to the end of this video. This path-traced version of Quake is an incredible way to play the game again, and is even a fun way for those newcomers who haven't played Quake, who just want to check out some interesting ray tracing and one of the best FPS titles of all time. If you did like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support DF on Patreon to enable more PC-focused vids like this in the future. Other than that, comment below, follow on Twitter. As always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.